Invisible Lives Taken Down. An ethnographic book on abuse, vulnerability, and recovery. Invisible Lives Taken Down is the continuation of 6 years of research into a reality that remains profoundly under-recognized. How human suffering can become transformed into an individual psychiatric problem, while the violence, deprivation, relationships, institutions, and histories producing that suffering disappear from view. The research brings together biology, neuroscience, psychiatric genetics, medical anthropology, ethnopsychiatry, collective mental health, and long-term ethnographic fieldwork, combining scientific investigation with lived experience. The central finding is not that psychiatric illness is unreal, that medicine has no value, or that professionals are inherently harmful. The problem is much more fundamental. It concerns what happens when an institutional interpretation becomes established and begins to determine everything that follows. A person's history can become progressively replaced by a record composed of diagnoses, previous allegations, family statements, clinical observations, and institutional decisions. Later professionals encounter that representation before they encounter the person themselves. If the original interpretation is wrong, each subsequent professional can unintentionally reinforce it, until repetition gives an unsupported account the appearance of independently established truth. The consequences become particularly serious when coercion is involved. A person subjected to restraint, involuntary treatment, isolation, or other coercive intervention may become frightened, exhausted, angry, withdrawn, or physically impaired. Those consequences can then be interpreted as further evidence that the intervention was necessary. The system acts upon an interpretation, produces consequences through its intervention, observes those consequences, and then uses them to validate the original interpretation. The person harmed by the system can consequently become the apparent proof that the system was right. This creates a profound inequality in credibility. The person subjected to the system is expected to demonstrate extraordinary consistency while under conditions that make consistency extremely difficult. Their distress becomes evidence, their resistance becomes evidence, their inability to recount events perfectly becomes evidence, and even their attempt to challenge the record can become evidence against them. Meanwhile, professional authority often retains its presumption of reliability even when decisions are contradictory. Evidence is ignored or serious complaints are inadequately investigated. The research shows how this can become a closed institutional circuit. A complaint challenges the very institution whose decisions produce the record. Another professional receives that same record and inherits its assumptions. Family members may have been incorporated into the established narrative, while other relationships have already been damaged. Financial resources, physical capacity, and social support may disappear. Eventually, the person can be left without any genuinely independent route through which their account can be examined. 6 years of fieldwork across Spain, Sweden, Italy, and Indonesia demonstrated that these mechanisms take different forms in different sociocultural environments. In Spain, the research encountered the danger of treating family as inherently protective when families can also be sites of serious violence and coercive control. In Sweden, administrative and professional systems demonstrated how cruelty can become embedded within apparently rational procedures. Trist provides an important positive historical example of democratic psychiatry, demonstrating that community, participation, and rights can replace institutional segregation and confinement. In Indonesia, fieldwork exposed the effects of colonial history, authoritarianism, inequality, and intimate forms of social control, including people being confined, restrained, and excluded from education, work, and ordinary social participation. Across these environments, one mechanism repeatedly emerges. The consequences imposed upon people are transformed into supposed characteristics of those people. Someone isolated is described as socially incapable. Someone weakened by abuse or treatment is described as incapable. Someone made dependent is described as inherently dependent. Someone whose credibility has been systematically undermined is described as unreliable. Chronicity can therefore become more than a clinical description. It can become a social trajectory produced through diagnosis, isolation, lowered expectations, lost opportunities, and prolonged dependency. This matters to practitioners and decision-makers because these are not isolated psychiatric issues. They involve medicine, psychology, social services, families, schools, welfare systems, legal institutions, residential facilities, employers, police, researchers, and communities. The distribution of credibility and authority throughout that entire chain determines whether abuse is investigated, whether coercion is imposed, whether education and employment continue, whether relationships survive, and whether a person retains meaningful control over their future. It matters equally to the wider population because these systems ultimately determine how society treats people when they become vulnerable. Women, racialized minorities, migrants, impoverished communities, disabled people, children exposed to abusive adults, and older people dependent upon care can face particular risks. When certain populations repeatedly experience greater exposure to coercion, exclusion, and disbelief, those patterns must be investigated as social and institutional phenomena, rather than explained solely through characteristics attributed to the individuals themselves. The path forward is not the abandonment of medicine or science. It is more rigorous science and better care. We need mixed methods, transparent reasoning, independent scrutiny, attention to cognitive bias, serious consideration of competing explanations, and meaningful incorporation of lived experience. Biological, clinical, psychological, ethnographic, and sociocultural evidence should be brought together rather than separated into competing territories. Professional expertise must remain accountable to evidence, human rights, and the person whose life is being affected. Care must also become genuinely recovery-oriented. Success should not be measured primarily by whether a person becomes easier to manage. It should be measured by whether they regain strength, relationships, education, work, autonomy, participation, safety, and the capacity to imagine a future. Recovery requires the social conditions in which recovery can actually occur. This research contributes by connecting domains that are too often separated: scientific evidence and lived experience, biology and anthropology, individual suffering and institutional structures, historical analysis, and contemporary practice. The book will bring the findings of the fieldwork and research into a form accessible beyond academia, while providing a basis for further research, public discussion, and collaboration. That is why I am asking you to support Invisible Lives, Taken Down. Supporting this project means supporting more than a book. It supports the continuation of research, fieldwork, analysis, and scientific communication aimed at making an otherwise neglected reality visible. It helps bring these questions to practitioners and decision-makers who can change institutions, but also to the wider public, whose understanding ultimately determines what forms of care and authority society considers acceptable. The objective is straightforward. Listen to those affected, investigate the circumstances surrounding suffering, scrutinize authority, distinguish evidence from inherited narrative, reduce coercion, protect complainants independently, pursue recovery, and measure success by whether people regain the greatest possible control over their own lives. ***, if you believe this research needs to be continued and brought into public view, please support the crowdfunding campaign and help make the book and the research possible. ***.